Cash and Coke. Reboot. Two brothers wreak havoc in the narcotics underworld. Written by Matthew B. Cox. Narrated by Keith Madison Miller. Slightly after midnight, Robert Snoop George III and his brother DeVell Hawkins pulled to the curb and shifted the metallic blue Mercury into park. Lush palm trees and palmetto bushes peppered the upscale subdivision in Cypress Gardens, Florida. Mediterranean-inspired Mac mansions with pools and freshly cut lawns lined the street. A concerto of crickets were chirping in the sticky summer humidity. Despite the frigid air conditioning, the siblings were sweating into the black t-shirts underneath their Kevlar vests. Adrenaline and anxiety coursed through their veins as Lil Wayne's "Fuck the World" thumped out of the speakers. The two 25-year-old black males were less than inconspicuous, sitting in the domestic mid-sized four-door in a predominantly white neighborhood where everyone drove European luxury sedans and SUVs. Most of the neighborhood was asleep that Tuesday night, but just behind the manicured hedges, there was a light on in the massive house at the end of the street. From the outside, it seemed like the typical subdivision home resting beside the lake. The neighbors had no idea that the well-kept house was owned by a Jamaican drug dealer, one of the most ruthless kingpins in all of Central Florida. Snoop and Hawkins had been told there would only be two occupants inside the house, the drug dealer and his sister, and a shitload of gwap and product. The brothers didn't want any problems, but they were prepared for them with a duffel bag containing a crowbar, zip ties, and Glock 45 calibers. The house went dark, and Lil Wayne went silent. Hawkins glanced at his watch and nodded to Snoop. It was time. They slipped on their black cotton ski masks and popped open the Mercury's doors. Camouflaged by the night, the two men slowly, stealthily approached the house. Surprisingly, the side door to the oversized garage was opened. With their weapons held high military style, they crept by the hunter green SUV and the kids' bicycles. They entered the unlit foyer, then the kitchen, then the living room, clearing each room as they went. As the two men slinked down the dark hallway in search of their prey, the brothers' hearts banged away inside their chests, like bricks inside a clothes dryer. In the first bedroom, there were 4 people sleeping, adult women and teenagers, piled in like refugees. 2 people my ass, thought Snoop. The place was packed with immigrants and family from the island. There were 5 more in the second room and 3 more in the next, but no Jamaican drug dealer. The frightened occupants cringed in terror as Snoop and his brother woke them. One by one, they yanked the groggy residents' hands behind their backs and tightened the plastic ties around their wrists. Then the siblings moved to the living room and placed everyone face down on the floor. 12 civilians, crying and whimpering into the carpet, and they still hadn't found the Jamaican dealer. Snoop noted the time. They'd already been in the house too long. He snatched the dealer's sister off the floor and growled, "Where's he at?" Terrified, she motioned down the hall with her chin. He led her to the master bedroom's door and tapped softly with the butt of his pistol. Within seconds, a massive 6.5-foot-tall Jamaican yanked open the door. A jolt of fear ripped through Snoop as the man's eyes pinged between himself and the woman. "What he here for?" snarled the man. Snoop steeled himself, shoved the woman aside, and jammed the barrel of his .45 caliber into the Jamaican's cheek. "I'm here for the bread and bricks, bitch," he barked. "Now get on your fucking knees." The dealer dropped to his knees, and Snoop ordered him to crawl down the hallway to the living room. While Hawkins zip-tied the Jamaican, Snoop emptied the 2 safes in the master bedroom's closet, stuffing a couple of dozen bundles of cash and several kilos of coke into the duffel bag. When they were finished, the brothers dashed out of the garage, leaving everyone lying on the living room floor, terrified but unharmed. Hours later in Hawkins' apartment, there was a knock at the door. It was 2 a.m. His girl looked through the peephole and saw a concave, silhouetted figure holding up a chrome Polk County Sheriff's Department 5-point star to the lens. Cop. She inhaled deeply, twisted the lock, and the bolt slid open. Snoop and Hawkins had just finished tallying up the score when the head of the county narcotics unit stepped into the apartment. His gaze ran over the 10 kilos of powder cocaine peeking out of the duffel bag, with a street value of $230,000, and lingered on the stacks of bills sprawling on the dining room table, $273,000 in worn U.S. currency sporting the grim faces of Alexander Hamilton, Andrew Jackson, and Ulysses Grant. Over $500,000 in cash and coke. It was a beautiful sight. "That's a nice lick," grunted the deputy, as Hawkins plucked $50,000 off the top of the pile and handed it to him. "I'll have another one for you in a couple of weeks." According to one prosecutor, Robert Snoop George III was a one-man crime wave. However, he wasn't a common street thug, a mugger, or a purse snatcher. Snoop was a professional, a modern-day privateer, robbing drug dealers and traffickers with surgical precision all over Florida and making millions in the process. The library at the Coleman Federal Correctional Complex in Central Florida is where I met Snoop. I should mention that I'm a very Caucasian, nonviolent, white-collar criminal serving a 19-and-a-half-year sentence. Caucasian will become relevant later. All of us do our time differently. Some inmates work out in the recreation yard. Others do nothing but study the stock market or bet on sports. I write my fellow inmates nonfiction stories. Sometimes it's a true crime. Sometimes it's a memoir. It probably sounds strange. Still, Monday through Friday mornings, I sit in the library with a group of black guys, most of which have been convicted of violent crimes, all of which are writing urban novels, fictitious tales depicting life on the streets with ruthless drug-dealing anti-heroes, snitches, and crooked DEA agents, graphic sex scenes, murders. The novels have names like Bitch, Animal, Cartel, Drug Dealer, etc. To look at these guys, my brethren, you wouldn't think they could string a sentence together. Every one of them has gold teeth and tattoos. 3 out of 5 of them have been shot. One guy's been stabbed. Snoop and Hawkins have their prison GEDs. And the other guys, who knows? They're a rough group, a serious group. However, over time, I've come to understand they're not all what they seem. There's Torin, the Somali Perpal, and Lonnie C.J. Clanton. Then there's Albert Boogie Avant, Darren K. Givens, DeVell Hawkins, and his half-brother Robert Snoop George III. At the time, the Somali was penning School Days, Boogie was composing 7 Recipes for Success, and Kay was writing The Gambler's Son. But CJ had already self-published Fed Wives, Hawkins had put out Saga, and Snoop had written Son of a Gunna. Sometime in February 2015, during a discussion about literary agents, I mentioned the urban novel market is saturated. That's why you gotta self-publish. Your writing is geared to young male blacks, arguably one of the smallest categories of literary demographics. On top of that, they were subdividing that demographic based on urban fiction. Kay rolled his eyes. He tends to do that when our opinions differ. And CJ said, "So what are you thinking? We should be writing true crime?" "Of course," I replied. "The material's all around us." I pointed to Snoop and Hawkins. These two have an amazing story. 2 brothers working with a dirty cop to take down drug dealers. It's Training Day meets Heat, and it's perfect for urban nonfiction. I then told him that black films were one of the fastest-growing genres in the industry, and the studios were moving away from fiction. The majority of new films are based on nonfiction books and magazine articles. Now, I don't know if any of that's true, but I'm a college-educated, Caucasian, white-collar criminal, the upper echelon of federal criminals. And these guys pretty much believe anything I say, with the exception of Kay, so... Okay, so why don't you write Snoop and Hawkins' story? That's how I ended up writing Cash and Coke. I told the 2 brothers I was willing to write a synopsis of their story and to try to get it into Fed or Don Diva, 2 of the more popular black magazines featuring true crime articles. We might be able to sell it for the film rights. I explained that if Snoop and Hawkins were willing to sign over their life rights and I was able to sell the rights in connection to the synopsis, I'd split it with them, 50-50. Hawkins wasn't interested, but Snoop was. Not a bad deal for a guy that's been locked up for several years and has done nothing with his story. Our first interview took place in Snoop's housing unit several days later. I hadn't written out our formal agreement yet, but Snoop didn't seem concerned. He's a more urban version of the actor Wesley Snipes, with a well-trimmed goatee and hard eyes. Unlike many of the other black inmates that populate the prison, Snoop has the unique ability to drop the tough guy persona that so many convicts suffer from and speak to me in a concise voice. But with the flip of a switch, he can turn the guttural bravado back on. However, I know it's a mistake to characterize Snoop's calm demeanor as manageable. At his core, He's a ruthless savage, dangerous, and untrustworthy. "So where do we start?" he asked, and I replied, "Childhood." By age 2, Robert Snoop George III's mother was so hopelessly addicted to cocaine, his grandparents had to take custody of the toddler. "She couldn't kick it," admits Snoop. "She loved me, but she couldn't raise me. She loved the drugs more." His grandparents were migrant workers following the harvest year-round. During summer breaks and weekends, Snoop worked in the fields from the age of 7 on. As workers picked oranges and strawberries, he would carry baskets of fruit and get water. "As a kid, it was fun," recalls Snoop. But even a child could see the toll that the back-breaking labor had taken on his elderly grandparents. He seldom saw his mother, and when he did, she was typically high and sporting some new drug dealer boyfriends. As for his father, he was non-existent. Reluctantly, Snoop told me, as a child, he felt abandoned by his mother and despised the men she spent her time with, and the drugs. Snoop was born and raised in Winter Haven, Florida, located off Interstate 4, smack dab between Orlando and Tampa. Its sprawling city limits are interwoven with upscale retirement communities and affluent gated communities. However, Snoop grew up wearing hand-me-downs and playing with broken toys, but he never went hungry. His grandparents had taken in aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandchildren into their home, any family member in need. Despite the amount of people living in the cramped house, he had little to no supervision. By the age of 10, he and his half-brother, DeVell Hawkins, were shoplifting. "We take an extra-large Burger King cup and walk into Kmart." Once in the toy section, the boys would stuff Transformer action figures into the containers and casually walk out the front door. Just a couple of kids drinking sodas. Within a few years, they graduated to Grand Theft Auto. It started off as joyriding and quickly evolved into a for-profit enterprise, stealing cars and selling them to auto body shops and junkyards for a few $100s. In 1991, he and Hawkins participated in a flash mob-style theft of roughly 20 vehicles, all simultaneously stolen out of a shopping plaza. Someone ended up running a red light, and within minutes, there were multiple sheriff's cruisers pursuing the convoy of stolen vehicles. Most of the auto thieves escaped, but Snoop and Hawkins ended up in handcuffs, with a 21-day sentence in the Polk County Detention Center. According to Hawkins, it wasn't much of a deterrent. "We were two of the biggest kids in juvie, so we wasn't scared of nothing." Upon their release, the siblings continued to steal cars. Over the next several years, they were in and out of the detention center almost a dozen times. Eventually, they were placed in a disciplinarian school. By middle school, Snoop and Hawkins were All-Americans, leading the district in football, basketball, baseball, and track. The teens were such gifted athletes that Westwood Junior High pulled the pair out of Lakeland Alternative School to play sports. "I daydreamed about being a professional athlete," says Snoop. "The game, the crowds, the fans, the money. It was my only real shot at a future." As a 6'2", 225-pound linebacker and running back for Winter Haven Senior High School's Blue Devils, Snoop was a freak of nature. He was a one-man wrecking crew according to his coaches, says Snoop. Sports overruled everything. His coaches were giving him Air Jordans and Tommy Hilfiger and paying him for touchdowns. His teachers were giving him A's. "I was an honor student and I didn't even go to class," said Snoop. "By the end of the 11th grade, I had full scholarships to the University of Alabama, Arkansas, and Michigan." Then, in early 1993, Snoop was supposed to meet up with several girls from his high school, and he thought they'd be impressed if he showed up in a new Cadillac. So he stole one out of a church parking lot. That one decision irrevocably changed the course of his life. Just before midnight, a Polk County Sheriff's cruiser pulled in behind Snoop and the three girls. The deputy hit the lights, and Snoop punched the gas. He led the cops on a high-speed chase with the girls screaming and pleading for him to pull over. Patrol vehicles seemed to be coming from all directions. Then he heard shots. It started with a single pop that turned into a hailstorm of lead pelting the exterior of the Cadillac. Snoop yanked the car down a side street and everyone ran. The star athlete leapt over several fences and disappeared. The doughboy deputies never even came close to catching him. "Two of the girls got caught," said Snoop. "They told the police who I was." The following morning, Polk County sheriffs surrounded his grandfather's house. But Snoop wasn't there. Later that day, his grandfather convinced him to go to the sheriff's office. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder of a law enforcement officer. "One of the deputies said I tried to run him over." However, none of the girls corroborated the deputy's fictitious story, so a month later the charges were dropped, and he was charged with over 50 grand theft autos. That was virtually every stolen vehicle in the county. The star athlete pled guilty and was sentenced to 4 years at the Brevard Correctional Institution, a youth offender prison, what's referred to as a gladiator school. It's the type of place that turns petty criminals into brutal thugs. A few months after Snoop got to the facility, his brother was sentenced to a mandatory 3 years for armed robbery. When Hawkins walked into his unit, they both started to laugh, but Snoop knew it wasn't funny. I'd blown it. The scholarships, my future. It was all gone, says Snoop, with a hint of a gangster grin and a glimmer of a gold incisor and canine. Over the next several years, I gave myself to the prison system. What emerged 3 years later was a mindless street thug with a get-rich-or-die-trying attitude. Weeks after Snoop's release from prison and days before his 21st birthday, the ex-All-American found himself living with friends in the St. Paul Project, scraping together a living on the backs of addicts like his mother, along with hundreds of other drug dealers. He'd become exactly what he despised. One night, 2 men rushed into the apartment yelling, "Get the fuck down!" They pointed revolvers at Snoop and his friends and demanded their money and drugs. "They took everything I had," says Snoop, "my cash and what little pride I had left." He was in a hopeless situation, broke and desperate with nowhere to turn. That's when I decided to start jacking dealers. His first robbery was a local street dealer, a Haitian Snoop had seen working the block. Snoop approached the man on the street corner and stuck a cheap chrome-plated Lorson .22 caliber auto in his belly. "Give me the money," growled Snoop nervously, glancing around the neighborhood. "Me give you nothing," spat the Haitian in broken English, cut with some Creole. Snoop couldn't believe it. The dealer wouldn't hand over anything. He couldn't leave empty-handed, so Snoop popped the Haitian in the ass with the .22 caliber. The dealer hit the concrete and started squealing in pain. Snoop yanked less than $1,000 in crumpled bills out of the bleeding man's pocket. "It wasn't even worth it," recalled Snoop. After the botched robbery, he decided to start doing his homework. "As a black man whose entire family lives in Winter Haven, I've got hundreds of cousins and most of them sell drugs." With the help of this vast network, Snoop was able to begin targeting street dealers holding large amounts of cash and coke. His next robbery yielded $6,000 and 15 ounces of crack cocaine with a street value of $12,000. The one after that produced nearly $20,000 and some powder worth $3,000. "Sometimes it was easy as pulling up to a dealer standing on the corner and jacking them," says Snoop. Other times he would have to stake them out, kick in their front door, and zip-tie them, then rummage through the apartment until he came up with the cash. Snoop's reputation for robbing dealers in Winter Haven got so bad when they saw Snoop or his vehicle, the dealers would start shooting at him and scatter like cockroaches in the light. I could be driving by a dope hole and these niggas would start shooting. Eventually, he had no choice but to begin hitting dealers in Miami, Tampa, Jacksonville. Then, in November 1996, Snoop and a small crew of Jack Boys were returning from Orlando, jacked up on adrenaline after robbing several street dealers. One of the crew, Popcorn, told Snoop to pull into an upscale subdivision near Winter Haven. They were driving through the neighborhood in a gray Oldsmobile wearing dark hoodies pulled tight around their faces. Popcorn saw a couple of snowbirds walking out of their garage and said, "Pull over." Snoop had never robbed a civilian, and he told Popcorn he wasn't about to. "Relax," snapped Popcorn. "Just stay in the car." Everyone but Snoop exploded out of the Olds and rushed into the garage. They snatched the man's wallet and his wife's purse, jumped back in the vehicle, and Snoop took off. They split up the cash and coke from the Orlando scores, but instead of discarding the credit cards from the home invasion, Snoop made the mistake of keeping them. Within hours of the robbery, he and his girlfriend ran up the cards at Eagle Ridge Mall without a problem. Then, on their way home, Snoop's girl insisted they stop at Walmart to buy Pampers for one of her girlfriends. With $130 worth of diapers sitting on the counter, the cashier told Snoop's girl there was a problem with the card. At the same time, 2 Winter Haven police officers approached the register. While eyeing Snoop and his girl, the officer asked the cashier, "Is this the woman using the credit card?" A credit card connected to a home invasion. Snoop whirled around and smashed the cop in the face. The officer slammed into a display case and dropped to the linoleum with a thud, out cold. Snoop bolted past the second officer, out of the store, and across the parking lot. As he crossed the highway, Snoop could hear sirens in the distance. Within seconds, the dragnet closed and there were cruisers everywhere. A nondescript sedan suddenly screeched to a stop in front of Snoop. The driver, some Good Samaritan citizen, according to Snoop, exited the vehicle with his hands held up, palms out. "Stop!" he yelled. "It's over!" In a panic, Snoop grabbed the Good Samaritan, yanked him aside, and jumped into his vehicle. Snoop hit the gas and simultaneously realized the vehicle was equipped with a dashboard radio and laptop, along with a shotgun mounted to the console. The Good Samaritan was actually the chief of police, says Snoop. He'd carjacked an undercover vehicle with a firearm in it. "I knew the cops would kill me, so I immediately stopped the car and jumped out with my hands in the air." Seconds later, a dozen officers tackled him to the asphalt. During the confusion, Snoop's girlfriend had slipped away. He was charged with fraudulent use of a credit card, battery on a law enforcement officer, 2 armed robberies, 2 burglaries, and attempted carjacking. At the lineup, however, the victims of the home invasion couldn't identify him. He'd never gotten out of the vehicle. All they were able to say was Snoop's hoodie looked similar to the men's apparel that had robbed them. Nor could anyone say he'd used the credit card. His girlfriend had. As far as the carjacking, the chief of police wasn't in the vehicle, and Snoop didn't have a weapon. "The state prosecutor didn't have much of a case," says Snoop. However, after 10 months of filing motions with the court, his attorney was unable to get the charges dropped. "My public pretender convinced me to plead no contest. He kept saying, 'The judge is a friend of mine. They play golf together or something. He knows there's no evidence. He'll probably get time served.' I got 30 fucking years." Hawkins and Roderick Mouse Stevenson were childhood friends from the neighborhood. However, for a time, their lives took very different paths. While Hawkins bounced in and out of jail, Mouse entered the police academy. He became a Polk County Sheriff's narcotics officer and was eventually placed in charge of the COP's, Community-Oriented Policing, Narcotics Unit, a task force specifically designed to fight drug activity in the Winter Haven area. Then, in early 2000, Hawkins got a visit from his old childhood friend. He had a very lucrative proposal. "Here's the deal," said Mouse. "I set up the dealers, and you take them down." Mouse had been using his position to extort protection money out of the large drug dealers and traffickers. Then when the time was right and the dealers had a significant amount of cash on hand, he was planning to set them up to get robbed. "As long as you don't get caught on the scene, I'll kill any investigation that points to you." Within a week, around 11 p.m., Hawkins got the call he'd been waiting for. Mouse was tailing a dealer who'd just left his residence. He gave Hawkins the address and told him the house was empty. "Who is he?" asked Hawkins, and Mouse chuckled. "Just some cracker." 10 minutes later, Hawkins kicked in the dealer's front door. He tore the house apart but didn't find anything of value other than a safe, which he didn't have the combination to, sitting in a bedroom closet. However, Hawkins was committed and couldn't turn back. His only choice was to wait for the dealer to return. Around 3 a.m., the guy stumbled through the front door with some woman Hawkins assumed he'd picked up at a bar. The house was trashed, furniture had been flipped over, and there were random household items lying everywhere. Before the dealer could react, Hawkins stepped out of the darkness, stuck his Glock 45 caliber into the guy's stomach, and snapped, "Open the fucking safe." The dealer hesitated. Hawkins yelled, "Now!" and pushed him and the woman into the back room. He zip-tied the couple and left them on the floor, then snatched $50,000 in cash, still in bank wrappers, 10 ounces of uncut heroin, and 1.5 kilos of cocaine out of the safe, and left. After that, Hawkins hit a Mexican running a grow house for 36 pounds of hydro but no cash. Then he smashed a couple of homeboys babysitting a stash house for 2 keys and $90,000. "It was a sweet deal," said Hawkins, sitting in the library. Mouse was never more than a few miles away listening to his police scanner. Despite Hawkins' athletic 6'4" frame, going into a house knowing there's a possibility of an armed criminal inside seemed reckless to me, dangerous. So I asked Hawkins if he was ever scared. He rears his thick upper lip in disgust and snarls, "No, I wasn't scared." I tell him there's no shame in it. Everyone gets scared. Revulsion streaks his face. "I ain't some kind of pussy-ass cracker. I'm a real nigga." You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I know what he was saying. I'd listened to he and his brother describing precisely what real niggas were. Specifically, they prided themselves on being brutal savages, ruthless, cruel, and above all fearless. In reality, they were sociopaths, void of civility or humanity. Jackson Correctional Institution in the Florida Panhandle is a level 5 prison designed to house the state's most violent inmates, an animal factory. The first night, according to Snoop, he laid in bed and listened to one of the new arrivals getting raped several cells down the tier. Riots, stabbings, and murders were a way of life at Jackson. There wasn't a day that went by when inmates weren't fighting or stabbing each other over something. Tennis shoes, commissary respect. He hadn't been there for a year when Snoop witnessed an inmate get stabbed to death over nothing. I never thought I'd get out of there alive. Then, in 2001, Snoop started to hear stories about a jailhouse lawyer, David Lighthead, who was achieving astonishing results. He took a look at my case, recalls Snoop, and then told me, I can get your sentence overturned. 2 months later, the court threw out Snoop's conviction and moved him back to Polk County Jail for trial. That's where Snoop met his father for the first time. Robert George Jr. was an older, more weathered version of himself, with a lifetime of regret written across his face. The older man timidly shook his 25-year-old son's hand and offered a weak apology for not being a father to him, for not being there to support him, but Snoop cut him off. I told him I didn't have no hard feelings for him, he says. Snoop could see the older man had nothing and no one to help him. I gave him everything in my locker. Top ramen soups, chips, sodas, everything. It was all I could do for him. It was more than he'd ever done for me. While Snoop was waiting to go to trial, the court issued a $100,000 bond. But I didn't have the money, he says. I ended up dialing a wrong number, and by a fluke, I got hold of a chick named Kimberly Jones who'd actually done some time for fraud. The two spoke several times over the next few weeks. Eventually, Jones came to visit him. I guess she liked what she saw, snickers Snoop, because she offered to put up the $12,000 required for my bond, and I was back on the streets. His brother had 2 Kevlar vests, ski masks, black fatigues, and binoculars laying on a table when Snoop arrived. Hawkins' typically neat and tidy apartment was littered with weapons and ammunition, like he was gearing up for a Black Ops mission. I need you, bro, said Hawkins as he tucked 2 clear plastic bags full of zip ties into a canvas duffel bag. I got a lick tonight. Snoop had been out of prison less than a week. What the hell's going on? You remember Mouse? Snoop and Hawkins hit the Jamaican's residence that night and scored over $500,000 in cash and coke. In late March, about halfway through the story, while sitting in the library one morning, I gave Snoop the contract spelling out our agreement for his life rights. He read it, but he didn't sign it. I need to have Frank look it over. Frank, a disbarred lawyer serving a 22-year sentence for wire fraud, is the resident go-to guy when it comes to legal work. Everyone knows Frank. It wasn't a big deal. The terms of our agreement were more than fair. However, days later, Snoop still hadn't signed. He told me he'd set up a meeting with Frank to discuss the contract further. Not a problem, I told him, and we continued working on his story. When another week went by, and I asked about the contract, Snoop said Frank needed a few more days. Once again, I didn't think anything of it. Snoop thought he was rich after he and Hawkins had scored the $500,000. He brought a new glossy white Chevy Avalanche, got his mouth grilled out, and moved into an upscale apartment complex in Tampa. Within 2 weeks of robbing the Jamaican, Mouse gave the siblings the address to a Mexican drug dealer who lived in a secluded area on the outskirts of Winter Haven. There's only one guy at the house, said the deputy, but he's armed. Snoop almost kicked the dealer's door out of the frame around 11 p.m. The brothers rushed in and caught the Mexican off guard and nowhere near his AK-47 assault rifle. They got $40,000 in cash and 100 pounds of weed, worth around $200,000, and left the dealer tied up on the kitchen floor next to his Kalashnikov. After that, we hit a Haitian for $60,000 and 8 keys of coke, says Snoop. A month later, we robbed another Jamaican for 12 keys and $100,000. Between scores, Snoop and his brother sold the stolen drugs to dealers and traffickers throughout Florida. When I pointed out the dichotomy between selling the drugs to drug dealers and selling them directly to addicts, Either way, they'd end up back on the streets in the hands of drug users like his mother. Snoop responds with a slight shrug and says, "I sleep at night." The Crankster Gangsters were a group of corrupt, meth-head sheriff's deputies that worked under Mouse in the cops' narcotics unit. "Fucking white boys think they don't have to pay their taxes," Mouse told the brothers one night in late 2001. He handed Hawkins the address of the Cranksters' methamphetamine lab and growled, "Put a hurting on 'em, but don't kill anyone." "They're police," replied Hawkins. "Fuck 'em," snapped Mouse. "They're fair game." For hours, the siblings cased the lakefront property located in an affluent subdivision of Winter Haven. At 2 a.m., with AK-47s in hand, they hit the house, quickly clearing the residence room by room. The place was empty, with the exception of a massive amount of lab equipment and chemicals. There were glass beakers connected to copper tubing running into air filtration units in the living and dining room, and gallons of lantern fuel and plastic bags full of Sudafed stored in the garage. "I'd never seen anything like it," said Snoop. "It was a massive meth lab. Everything in the place had a toxic yellow tint." They found $30,000 in a kitchen cabinet and 7 pounds of what looked like bags of broken glass. Meth. "We got over $120,000 for the ice." In early February 2002, Snoop's new criminal defense attorney called him with an offer from the assistant state attorney. 9.5 years. "My lawyer didn't want me to take it," says Snoop. The state couldn't locate the snowbirds who Snoop's crew had robbed 5 years earlier. "He kept saying, 'The state doesn't have any witnesses. We can win this at trial.' But I was there. A trial could go either way." On February 15th, Snoop accepted the state prosecutor's offer. Despite the credit for time served, he still owed the great state of Florida a few years behind bars. While Snoop was counting down the days until his release, the FDLE, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, launched an investigation into Mouse's operation. In the early morning hours of February 26, 2004, the DEA arrested Mouse, along with 30 of his co-conspirators, on charges of conspiracy to distribute crack cocaine. Mouse immediately began cooperating. While sitting with Hawkins during one of our interviews, I asked, "Were you worried? You'd been robbing drug dealers for Mouse for nearly 2 years, and he was cooperating. People were being arrested." "Nah," replies Hawkins with a hard, sinister grin. "See, I done a murder for Mouse. He had a problem with this fucking guy, and he paid me to do him. So I knew Mouse was going to keep my name out of his mouth. Had Mouse mentioned Hawkins, he could have opened himself up to a charge of conspiracy to commit murder, potentially a life sentence. Maybe I should have pursued the murder angle, but it didn't seem relative to Snoop's story. Besides, I doubt Hawkins would have given me much more had I pushed. He may be a brutal thug, but he wasn't stupid." Regardless, 1 year after Mouse was arrested, Leonard Henderson, Hawkins' roommate, sold a $10 crack rock to a confidential informant working for the cops' narcotics unit. A week later, narcotics officers raided Henderson and Hawkins' house. "I was dead asleep when they kicked in the door," says Hawkins. Because Hawkins was a convicted felon in possession of a firearm and drugs, his case was picked up by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. He was charged with trafficking crack cocaine. "I was sentenced to 22 years. I haven't even sold him anything." Snoop was released from Florida State Prison on August 15, 2005. His brother and Mouse were serving long federal prison sentences with Buck Roger release dates. He was 29 years old, broke, and he wasn't about to work a real job. "I thought about robbing a bank, but the average bank robber gets less than $5,000 and a potential federal sentence," says Snoop. He quickly put together a solid crew of guys willing to do whatever he needed. There was Meat, a light-skinned, muscular career criminal, and Chandel Coates, Snoop's sister's boyfriend, fresh off the boat from Jamaica. "Chandel was a hustler," says Snoop. "He'd do anything for money, sell drugs, drive semi-trucks, wash cars, anything." Snoop put the word out to his vast array of cousins and friends on the street. "I was willing to pay for information on large drug traffickers, anything that led to a serious lick." They started by robbing a couple of low-level street dealers for several grand and some product. "Just like the old days," he says. "But we quickly moved up the food chain to the big-time traffickers." At the same time, according to Snoop, several friends told him local, state, and federal law enforcement were gunning for him. They'd gotten his brother and Mouse, and now they were coming for him. One of those law enforcement officers was Detective Clark, a tall, blonde-haired, fair-skinned Boy Scout. with the Winter Haven Police Department's HIDTA, High Intensity Drug Task Force Area Narcotics Squad. Snoop and his brother had been on their radar for some time. Within months of his release, the Narcotics Squad was getting tips from confidential informants. Drug traffickers Snoop had robbed were calling. HIDTA knew he was active. People in the drug community wanted him off the street. Deputy Aisha Wilson with the DeSoto County Sheriff's Office was the sexiest chick Snoop had ever seen. A 5-foot 5-inch high yellow Rita Ora with curves you don't see on a white girl, according to Snoop. They met through a mutual friend during a Plies concert at the Winter Haven Bottle Club. The chemistry was unmistakable. She called 2 days later. They moved in together 2 weeks after that. During the day, the couple would lounge around at Clearwater Beach, and at night they'd hit the infamous Mons Venus strip club in Tampa. "She was a bad bitch," said Snoop, "and up for anything and everything." The deputy knew precisely what her boyfriend did for a living, and according to Snoop, she didn't have no problem with it. One night, Snoop, Meat, and another friend everyone called Skinny Dre, who suffered from sickle cell anemia, were on their way back from partying in Orlando. They were driving up Interstate 4 in Meat's Dodge Challenger, approaching Lake Alfred, when Snoop recalled a tip he'd gotten regarding a Haitian moving coke up and down the coast. He'd been staking out the trafficker's apartment on and off for the last week, waiting for the right time to strike. "Pull in here," ordered Snoop. "What?" asked Meat. "Some hoes live here?" "No," replied Snoop. "I done my homework on Buddy up here." He could see the anxiety in Dre's face, but Snoop knew he couldn't back down, not in front of him, and Meat was always ready for a quick lick. As the three men pulled into the apartment complex, Meat spotted several vehicles at the adjacent recreation area near the lake, with a dozen law enforcement types standing around in the dark. "What's up with them?" he asked. "They police?" "Don't worry about them," growled Snoop. In fact, the small group was made up of Detective Clark and several other officers with the HIDTA Narcotics Squad, suiting up for a raid on the Haitian's apartment. The Charger came to a stop. Snoop slid a clip into his Mac 11 submachine gun and chambered a 9mm round. The three men shot out of the Dodge. The ex-All-American took 3 quick steps and kicked in the front door. There was a woman at the kitchen sink. She immediately started screaming as the 2 men rushed in. Snoop found the trafficker in his bedroom lying naked on the mattress. He jammed the barrel of the weapon to his temple and barked, "Where's the shit?" "I got nothing," said the Haitian, as Meat stepped in the room with the female. Snoop smashed the butt of his Glock into the side of the Haitian's head, but he wouldn't give up the cash. The woman was screaming loud enough for the neighbors to hear, and Snoop looked at his watch. Too long. They'd already been there too long. The situation was deteriorating fast. Snoop was about to bust a cap in the Haitian's ass when Dre walked into the room holding a toddler by his Oshkosh Bigosh overalls. The couple froze, and Snoop could see the fear in their eyes. He reached over and grabbed the toddler by his suspenders and slowly, effortlessly lifted the child to his face. He placed his weapon to the baby's head, and the woman frantically shrieked, "It's in the closet! It's in the closet!" 12 kilos of cocaine, worth $276,000, and $30,000 in cash. Over $300,000 in cash and coke. Snoop found out months later, minutes after he and his crew tore out of the parking lot. Clark and the HIDTA Narcotics Squad rushed into the residence with a search warrant. They found nothing but the Haitian, his girlfriend, and the toddler crying in the bedroom. Snoop was wearing Tommy Hilfiger and polo and driving a new heart-pounding 550-horsepower cream Cadillac CTSV. "I was trading stolen keys for vehicles from a guy I'd been locked up in the state with," says Snoop. The ex-Florida State Prison inmate's family owned H&K Auto Finance. Snoop had 2 Cadillacs in his garage and a Dodge Magnum with a Hemi sitting in his driveway. Snoop, his buddy Joshua Furman, and his cousin Bam Bam would party at Club 112 and the Underground until midnight, then hit strip clubs like Deja Vu and Hollywood Nights, while other patrons were slipping single-dollar bills into the garters and G-strings of the exotic dancers seductively working the stripper poles and twerking their asses. Snoop and his pals were throwing thousands of dollars of stolen drug money at them. "Josh was a real ladies' man," laughed Snoop. "There wasn't a club he didn't end up pulling some stripper out of." By April 2015, Snoop hadn't signed the contract. He continued to say that Frank was looking it over and needed more time. I sensed something wasn't right, so I made a point of sitting with Frank during dinner in the cafeteria. I asked him when he planned to meet with Snoop regarding the contract. "I already met with him around 2 weeks ago," replied Frank. "We went over the terms, and I advised him to sign it." "Why?" "He said you were still reviewing." "No," chuckled Frank, "I don't have it. Snoop does." In an attempt to get my head around Snoop's lies, I tracked down Kay. He was standing outside his housing unit. "He's planning to rip you off," Kay told me, after I explained the issue. "That's what he does. Actually, that's what they both do. Kay is here for armed robbery. He's planning on taking the story you write, rewriting it a little, and sending it in to Don Diva. He can't write it himself. You read his shit." I'd read a chapter and a half of Snoop's urban novel. Son of a gunna. Even by urban novel standards, it was pretty bad. Horrible. I can't comment on the storyline since I didn't read the entire book. However, the typos and grammar alone made it virtually unreadable. I'm helping the guy out, and he's trying to fuck me over. Kay told me Snoop was a scumbag. "He's just waiting on you to finish it up and hand it to him," said Kay. "Some people you just can't help." Regardless of the revelation, the following morning, I sat at the writer's table with Snoop and the other novelists, but didn't mention anything to Snoop. I was almost finished with the story's outline. Instead, I asked, "When you robbed these guys, were you only interested in cash and drugs?" "Nah," he grunted. "I'd grab anything of value, drugs, jewelry, whatever. I robbed a tax fraud guy of 20 TurboTax debit cards with over 100 grand on them. He was always grabbing weapons. AK-47s, Smith & Wessons. Once I got a cheap 380 high-point blank with an extended clip. I only took it because I liked the way the extended clip looked." Things didn't always go according to the plan. During a robbery in Tampa, Snoop and a partner crept up on a gang of street thugs trafficking a significant amount of coke throughout Florida. "We yanked out our pieces and said, 'This is a jack. Lay down.' And they scattered off," says Snoop. One of the thugs went for his weapon. Instinctively, Snoop pulled the trigger of his Mac, but nothing happened. "It went click, click, click," reminisces Snoop with a grin. The dealer pulled out a revolver. Snoop spun around and took off. The dealer fired 3 times. One round slammed into the back of Snoop's Kevlar vest. "It felt like someone hit me with a baseball bat," he says. The slug knocked the wind out of him, and Snoop was slammed into the concrete sidewalk. A split second before the dealer finished him off, Snoop's partner fired a double-barrel shotgun at the dealer, throwing him backwards through an open doorway. Snoop doesn't know if the guy survived. Another time, Bam Bam got busted by the DEA and decided to cooperate. He set up a dealer named Fat Tony on a conspiracy to distribute charge. However, Bam Bam didn't anticipate Fat Tony getting out on bond. "Me and Aisha were at a Red Lobster when I got a call from this chick yelling, 'They've got your sister and cousin trapped inside Mr. Tony's clothing store. She said they're going to kill him,' says Snoop. Bam Bam wanted to leave the store, according to Snoop's sister, LaToya Grant. Bam Bam kept saying, 'Them fake-ass niggas ain't strapped like that, they're faking.' But she wouldn't let him leave. She was sure Fat Tony would kill him. Aisha ran the red lights the whole way to the clothing store. Within a minute or two, they pulled up on the scene. Snoop saw Fat Tony and a gang of 8 street guys known as the Turner Boys blocking the clothing store's entrance. Everyone was packing heat. Snoop grabbed both of Aisha's Smith & Wesson semi-automatics out of her lockbox as the vehicle screeched to a stop in the parking lot. He leapt out of the passenger side and opened fire with both weapons. Fat Tony and the Turner Boys squealed like 12-year-old girls as the 9mm slugs slammed into the vehicles and surrounding buildings. As the many kinetic explosions blew holes in stucco and disintegrated windshields, the gang ran off into the neighborhood and disappeared. "I unloaded 2 full magazines into them from 20 feet, and I didn't hit one of them," says Snoop with a shake of his head. "Not one of them." Haitian Mike, a big-time drug dealer, contacted Snoop. Mike knew the day and time of a meeting of 24 Haitian dealers. "There's going to be a lot of cheddar." There was only one problem. "It's in Little Haiti." "Shit," hissed Snoop. Little Haiti was a block from the Winter Haven Police Department. The day of the meeting, Snoop and Chandel drove by the neighborhood to check out the players, and Snoop couldn't believe his luck. Standing in front of several houses with the Haitians was his partner Meat. Snoop called him on his cell, explained the situation, and asked, "You got heat on you?" "Uh-huh," he replied. "I got fire. "Bust a shot and tell them niggas it's a jack," said Snoop, as he and Chandel exited the Charger and made their way down the alley. "Then chase him to the back." Seconds later, Snoop heard the pop, pop, pop of a .45 and the Haitians shrieking in terror. They scurried around the corner of the house and ran head-on into Snoop and Chandel holding AK-47s. "Oh shit!" screamed several of the Haitians. "It's crazy, man! Get on the ground!" yelled Snoop. The robbery took less than 4 minutes and yielded over $300,000 and 10 kilos of cocaine worth $230,000. As Snoop, Chandel, and Meat pulled out of Little Haiti, police cruisers were racing out of the station's parking lot to the scene. Detective Clark spotted Snoop and followed the Dodge to the Dynaway apartment complex. While sitting in his undercover Chevy Malibu, Clark snapped photos of Snoop and the others splitting up the proceeds. Then Snoop made eye contact with the detective and yelled, "Haul ass! It's the police!" They jumped in their vehicles and took off in different directions, losing the undercover in the maze of back roads that make up Winter Haven. By this point, Snoop and Aisha's relationship was over. "She and a couple of girlfriends was at the Mirage, John Gotti Jr.'s place in Tampa," says Snoop. While at the club, Aisha met an NFL player with the Cleveland Browns. "They hooked up that night, and I ain't seen my bitch since." Roughly the same time, Snoop was introduced to a voluptuous, dark-skinned beauty at a Gucci Mane concert. Kawana Robinson was a sharp, hard-working woman that ran her own clothing distribution company. "I always thought she looked like that rap singer Missy Elliott," says Snoop. It didn't take long before Kawana started hearing the rumors about her boyfriend. She wanted him to stop, but he wouldn't. Snoop told her he had it all under control. Hawkins approached me outside my housing unit a day or two after I figured out what Snoop was up to. Although they're brothers, neither seemed to like the other. So when Hawkins asked me how Snoop's story was going, I didn't hesitate to say, "He's trying to rip me off. He thinks he's going to get his hands on the story and pass it off as his," which was preposterous. I explained to Hawkins that everything I write is date-stamped by the Bureau of Prison's Core Links email system. It would be easy to prove I was the author of the story, I said. Even if he were to sell the rights, I could easily prove it was my story. Hawkins grunted. "Yeah, he said something about that when you started writing." Hawkins had told Snoop it was a bad idea, but Snoop wouldn't let it go. "He don't understand that half of something's worth more than nothing at all. He's always been like that." The following morning, I was watching the local news out of Orlando, and I saw a segment on Kay's co-defendant getting sentenced. He got 9 years. However, during the segment, the news showed video surveillance of the CVS pharmacy Kay and his co-defendant had robbed, while wearing ski masks, of course, and both of their booking photos. So the moment I got to the library, I began mercilessly mocking Kay at a fictitious lineup. The newscaster said the cashier couldn't ID you, but she swore she'd recognize your voice. "So the Orlando cops had a voice lineup with you and 4 other guys," I said, glancing around the table at my brethren. Kay was number 3. At this point, Kay started shaking his head at me while trying to suppress a grin. Everyone else at the table was smiling and showing lots of gold teeth. They had the first guy step forward and say, "Give me all the cash, bitch." But the cashier doesn't recognize his voice. So the second guy steps forward and says, "Give me all the cash, bitch." She doesn't recognize his voice either. Then Kay stepped forward and said, "That's not what I said." Everyone at the table burst into laughter. When everything calmed down, Snoop asked me when he could read the synopsis. Everyone at the table glanced in our direction. "I'm almost finished," I replied. Kay and Hawkins grinned at me. "Give me another week and I'll print you out a copy. No problem." Right, said Snoop. "So," I asked, changing topics, "how'd you get jammed up in 2007? Nathaniel Everett, a kid from Snoop's neighborhood, decided to cooperate with the HIDTA Narcotics Squad shortly after his arrest in late 2007, his thinking being, why go to prison when I can send a friend? That friend was Robert Snoop George III. "I got an easy lick for you," said Everett. He knew a local female dealer named Toya Taylor. "She's sitting on $250,000 and 20 bricks. "Sounds good," replied Snoop cautiously. "Where's the house?" Everett drove Snoop by Taylor's house, a single family in a lower middle-class neighborhood. "There it is," said the informant. "No one will be there tonight, but bring a gun just in case." What Everett didn't know was that Snoop already knew who Taylor was. He'd been staking out her house for weeks, and they weren't sitting in front of her house. Something wasn't right. "Give me a couple hours, and I'll let you." He never called Everett back, and he stopped returning his phone calls. Several days later, Everett's girlfriend's aunt called Snoop. She had a buyer at the local Super 8 motel. A cracker that wants 4 ounces of heart, she said. It was a quick $4,000 for some stolen crack. Despite her connection to Everett, the deal sounded legit and it felt right. She gave Snoop the buyer's number. When he and Chandel pulled into the motel, Detective Clark's informer climbed into the back of the GT. Snoop handed him the product, and the informant said, "That's real pretty." Then, all hell broke loose. Several undercover vehicles screeched into the parking lot, while HIDTA officers swarmed out of multiple motel rooms, screaming, "Out of the car! Out of the car!" with their weapons trained on the GT. "Oh, hell no," thought Snoop. He was in possession of crack and a weapon, armed trafficking. For a black man, according to Snoop, that's a life sentence. He turned to Chandel and snapped, "Drive!" "It's the police," he whimpered. "I'm not gonna run from the—" Snoop jammed his semi-auto into Chandel's ribs and growled, "Drive, nigga!" Chandel stomped on the accelerator and the Pontiac shot forward, sideswiping an undercover sedan on its way out of the parking lot. A minute later, they were racing down back roads, zigzagging until there wasn't a police vehicle in sight with the terrified informant begging for them to let him out. Chandel slowed down slightly. Snoop leaned over the front seat, stuck his weapon in the informer's face, and barked, "Get out, cracker!" The man hit the asphalt with a thud and rolled like a rag doll. Within 10 minutes, Snoop and Chandel had ditched the weapons and the drugs and were sitting on Snoop's sister's couch, 2 blocks from the Winter Haven Police Department, waiting for the HIDTA to show up. Suddenly, there was an explosion of wood and paint chips. The door flew open, and 10 officers wearing full SWAT gear poured into the apartment with M4 assault rifles held high, yelling, "Get on the ground! Get on the ground!" They slammed Snoop and Chandel onto the carpet, cuffed, and transported them to the police department. In the interview room, Detective Clark told Snoop, "You can thank your buddy Nathaniel Everett for this one. This time you're going away permanently." "What are you talking about?" responded Snoop. "I've been home all day. You got the wrong guy." After a few months, it became apparent to the prosecutor that there wasn't any evidence. The informant had never gotten a good look at Snoop or Chandel. They didn't have any drugs or weapons. Eventually, the prosecutor's office offered George a plea, simple possession and 1-year probation. He took the deal. "It wasn't until Kawana got pregnant that I started thinking about quitting," says Snoop. Law enforcement was actively trying to build multiple cases against him, and they weren't going away. If that wasn't bad enough, every drug trafficker, dealer, and confidential informer on the street was working with him. In addition, Snoop was sitting on a significant amount of cash and coke, and someday, if things didn't change, someone would come looking for the money. "That's the kind of shit that keeps you up at night." His son was born in December 2007. "I remember holding this perfect, helpless little baby and thinking, what if someone stuck a gun to his head?" He didn't want to put his son through that. He wouldn't put him through it. "I didn't run out and get a job digging ditches or anything, but I did stop jacking dealers." He bought Kawana and the baby a new house and started looking for rental properties. "I was selling off the last of the bricks and I was out." I hadn't mentioned the contract to Snoop for a few weeks, but now I had an outline of the entire story. I was still writing, fact-checking, but I had everything I needed from Snoop. So sometime in late April 2015, around 9 a.m., while sitting in the library with my fellow writers, I asked Snoop about the contract. He started to say something about Frank needing more time, and I interjected. I spoke with Frank, but I didn't expand on it. "You understand the contract was to protect you from me, not me from you," I said. I explained that as the author of the piece, I possess ownership, and I could publish it in any form I choose and sell it as intellectual property. I was willing to split everything 50-50 if you'd allow me to attach your life rights to the project. But now you're trying to fuck me over. Snoop leaned in very close to me and growled through his gold teeth. "See, I'm the kind of nigga that'll kill a bitch if I think I'm getting fucked." His breath stank so bad I had to hold my own breath to keep from gagging. It could peel paint. It was that bad. "You know what I'm saying?" The likelihood that Snoop will get out of prison and stay out of prison for any length of time in the future was slim. So I replied, "I'll take my chances." The following day, I finished the story. On February 28, 2008, Joshua Furman called Snoop. He had a buyer for 2 birds. Snoop agreed to meet up. Kawana begged him not to do it, not to go. But Snoop wouldn't listen to her. He said he could trust the guy. They went way back. However, later that night, when Snoop arrived at the meeting, Furman was on his cell, nervously bickering with his girlfriend, who turned out to be Detective Clark. Furman was so anxious and agitated, something just didn't feel right. Snoop refused to give him the keys. He didn't want Furman going home and fighting with his girlfriend with 2 keys sitting in the trunk of his car. Snoop told him to call him back when he got his shit together. He got back in his black Dodge Magnum and headed home. 2 miles down Southwest Brent Avenue, a Polk County Sheriff's patrol vehicle pulled him over. No big deal. Snoop had a fake driver's license and his Dodge was clean, with the exception of the cheap .380 High Point underneath the driver's seat and the 2 kilos of coke underneath the passenger's seat. Snoop handed the female deputy his ID and waited. Several minutes passed, and the deputy returned with Snoop's fake ID. "It's going to be a couple of more minutes," she said. Simultaneously, sheriff's cruisers and undercover vehicles came from all directions. "I mashed the gas," says Snoop. He couldn't let them arrest him with 2 kilos in the weapon. That wasn't going to happen. He hit the back streets going 100 miles an hour with a dozen vehicles tailing behind the Dodge. George broke the cocaine into pieces on the steering wheel and threw it out the window. At one point, the police looked like ants, he says. That's when I tossed the gun. The second the .380 hit the bushes, he thought, there's no fucking way they'll find it. It's gone. Several turns later, the Magnum entered Highway 27. George saw the patrol car and the deputy, but he didn't see the spike strip until it was too late. The tires blew out and the Dodge swerved. Then the rubber came off and the vehicle was on rims, shooting sparks into the air. After 10 minutes, the police had had enough, and one of the vehicles slammed into the Dodge, causing the vehicle to spin and stall. The former All-American made his last run. He sprinted into a neighborhood and leapt over several fences with 2 canines at his heels. "That's when they shot me in the back with the taser," smirked Snoop. 9,000 volts of current ripped through him, and he hit the ground. Sitting in an interview room hours later, despite being tased, bitten by one of the German shepherds and kicked in the eye by a deputy wearing what felt like a size 50 steel-toed boot, Snoop was feeling optimistic. He'd discarded the drugs and the weapon. The most the police had on him was fleeing and eluding and use of a fake ID. Then Detective Clark walked in and set a clear plastic evidence bag on the table containing a .380 High Point with an extended clip. "It took some doing," said Clark as a mischievous grin crept across his face. "But we found your gun." The ATF agents showed up shortly after that. Snoop was transferred to federal custody as an armed career criminal in possession of a firearm and sentenced to 15 years. The Bureau of Prisons shipped him to Coleman Federal Correctional Complex in Central Florida. "Same place my brother was doing time," says Snoop. Ironically, Snoop and Hawkins are locked up with some of the same dealers and traffickers they'd robbed on the street. None of them know it, though. Since Snoop's incarceration, he's focused his energy into honing his skills as a writer. He self-published Son of a Gunna, his first book in what he hopes to be a series, early last year. "I'm hoping to turn my street experiences into a writing career," says Snoop. However, when I posed the very real possibility of failing as a novelist and asked about his alternative career plans, Snoop smiled wide, displaying a mouthful of gold teeth. "Well," he chuckles while conspiratorially glancing around the library, "I know where there's this jewelry store." Sometime in June 2015, well after I'd finished the synopsis, Snoop must have realized he'd made a mistake. I was sitting in my cell. It's more of a concrete block cube, and Snoop rushed in. Slightly out of breath, he glanced around looking for the correctional officer assigned to my housing unit. Per policy, inmates aren't supposed to be in an unassigned unit. He could have gotten in trouble. "Hey," Snoop huffed. "I was just talking with Frank about the contract. He said I should sign it, but he wants to read the story first." "Sure," I replied, feigning excitement at the prospect of Snoop signing over his life rights. "I'll get you a copy." I jumped out of my seat and pretended to frantically sift through my locker. I could see a glimmer of anticipation in Snoop's eyes as I flipped through several file folders. Then I froze, turned to him, and said, "It's not here. I'll have to print you another copy." Snoop nodded while a grin crept across his face, but I didn't move. "So," he said, "when are you going to print it off?" "As soon as you sign the contract." I laughed, and I dropped back into my chair. Snoop squinted his eyelids at me, knowing and grinned. "Come on, bro," I said. "I'm a con man. There's no scenario where you get one over on me." Cash and Coke reboots Barbed Wire Backstory. Written by Matthew B. Cox. Narrated by Keith Madison Miller. Not all of the stories work out the way I'd hoped. Obviously, Cash and Coke is one of those stories, hence the reboot. Once I knew the subject was unsalvageable, I decided to use the synopsis as an example of what I'm up against. Although I've met several innocent people, the vast majority of the inmates in federal prisons around the country are guilty. They may have been given a draconian sentence, but they're guilty of the crimes they're here for. They're criminals, and criminals are difficult to deal with. They're unpredictable, and many are unrepentant, sociopathic career criminals that can't wait to get out and reoffend. The difference between the original Cash and Coke and the reboot is the addition of the sub-story regarding Snoop's attempt to rip me off. The base story's unchanged. Both versions are available for sale. You've been listening to Cash and Coke Reboot. Two brothers wreak havoc in the narcotics underworld. Written by Matthew B. Cox. Narrated by Keith Madison Miller. Copyright by Matthew B. Cox.